Senseless, savage, the worst crime in the county's history. These some of the phrases people here are groping for to try to express their shock and revulsion at the crime.
October 1970, Santa Cruz, a mansion on the hill engulfed in flames, reveals a gruesome scene. An entire family and their secretary murdered in cold blood, and beside them, a cryptic note condemning, quote, materialistic pigs, left everyone wondering who could commit such a brutal crime. And was this just the beginning of Santa Cruz's descent into the darkness as murder capital of the world? Today, we unravel the shocking, solved mystery of the Ohta murders. This is REDRUM, stories about the true victims of crime. I use news archives, documentary footage and books to research these cases, and so the episodes are accurate to the source material I can find. You can find all episodes as a podcast or YouTube version in the description box below.
Nighttime net of security was set up at all entrances leading to Dr. Ohta's mountaintop home.
Okay, picture this. It is a warm summer's evening in 1969 in California. It's the time of free loving, hippie style. There's hitchhiking, peace and love, drugs and rock and roll of the upcoming 1970s. The Quentin Tarantino movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, is a really good visual for anyone like me who just wasn't around then and didn't really know a huge amount about that time period. It was August of that year, and Sharon Tate and 4 of her friends, people she knew, were murdered by the Manson family. That leads into our case. So a very brief overview of that case is that on the night of the 8th of August 1969, there were 4 people who were instructed by Charles Manson to, quote, totally destroy everyone in the Los Angeles house that Sharon Tate was living in. One of the members, Tex Watson, climbed this telephone pole that was near the entrance gate to Sharon's home, and he cut one of the telephone lines leading to the house. The group then got out of the car and they walked up the hill that led to the house. First, Tex came across a man called Stephen and he shot him and just left him to die in his car right outside of the property. Then Tex walked closer to the house to a lower window, and it had a screen on the front of it. So he cut that screen out and then he entered through that window. Another member of the Manson family kept watch whilst the others continued inside. It wasn't long before Tex came across the first member in the house, and that was Wojciech Wajkowski, and he was on the living room sofa. He was asleep. And so Tex walked up to him, kicked him in the head before saying, quote, I'm the devil and I'm here to do the devil's business. The rest of the Manson family members brought in Sharon Tate and also Jay Sebring and Abigail Folger. They brought them into that same room and began to tie them up. Jay was clearly concerned for his friend Sharon, who at this point was 8.5 months pregnant. So he spoke up. But this just angered Tex and he just shot Jay right there and then. There was then a kind of struggle that ensued, and Wojciech did actually manage to escape, momentarily at least. He got himself out onto the kind of porch area of the house, but Tex caught up to him relatively quickly and he killed him by stabbing and shooting him. Altogether, he suffered 51 stab wounds. Meanwhile, back in the house, Abigail had actually managed to escape from her restraints and she'd made it out towards the pool area. But 2 members of the Manson family caught up to her and they did eventually murder her. They actually ended up stabbing her 28 times. And then 2 members of the Manson family murdered Sharon. They stabbed her 16 times and she did plead with them, offering herself as a hostage and asked them to please just keep her alive long enough for her to give birth to her baby. But they had no mercy, and after they had stabbed her and she was still alive, they then ended up hanging her, and that is how she eventually was killed. The very next night, that same group of killers went on to another house, and it was a house nearby, and it's there that they killed Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. It was soon after those 7 deaths that Charles Manson and his followers, or some of his followers, were arrested. And this was the first string of murders committed by people who assigned themselves to the, quote, hippie community. And this series of murders was on everyone's radar. It really had a significant impact on America, and It's really thought to have profoundly shaken the way that America viewed itself at this time. It was a little over a year after those horrific murders. It was on the 19th of October 1970 that two police officers were driving past this area of Santa Cruz in California. They noticed in the distance that there was this thick black smoke pouring out of a property on Rodeo Gulch Road. The officers called the local fire department and they arrived soon after. Now, the fire engines arrived, but they couldn't actually get through to the property where the smoke was coming from, because as they pulled up on the driveway, their path was actually blocked by two vehicles, a red Rolls-Royce and a black and gold Lincoln Continental. They'd been parked across the front and back driveways, and by all accounts it did seem a little bit suspicious. It almost seemed as though they'd been purposefully parked there across the driveways to ensure that no one could enter or leave. The firefighters tried the vehicle doors, but they were both locked, and so they smashed the window of the gold and black Lincoln, and they did manage to move it out of the way and get their fire engines in. The firefighters found that the fire had spread throughout the house, and it seemed as though it had been started from different entry points. Even at this early stage, it was crystal clear that this fire had been intentionally set. Now, they couldn't actually find any evidence that anyone was inside of the property, a good sign for them, an indication that no one had been home. And so they then headed round to the back of the property where it was well known that there was a swimming pool back there, and they could use that as an additional water source. They also knew there was a fire hydrant back there. The chief firefighter began searching around for the fire hydrant, but he couldn't actually find it in the dark, and so that's when he whipped out his torch, flashlight, and he started to look around. He flashed the light ahead of him, but instead of finding the fire hydrant, he came across a gruesome scene, something he never in his wildest dreams thought he'd ever have to deal with. First, he saw the face of a boy, probably younger than teenage age, and he was lying in the pool face down. As he got closer to the body to confirm it was this young boy, he looked beyond and he saw towards the end of the pool that there was another body. Beyond that, there were a further two bodies. It was clear that these 5 victims were dead, and so the firefighter made his way back to the fire engine and they called for the police. Police arrived soon after, and they confirmed that the 5 bodies were deceased, and they had all been tied or bound with these kind of colourful scarves.
All were found shot to death, their bodies thrown into the Ohta swimming pool.
Although an official post-mortem would have to determine the exact cause of death, from an initial examination, it seemed as though they'd all been shot and that's how they died. Then they were either thrown in the pool after they were shot or they were in the pool as they were shot. The identification of the victims did not take very long at all. The owners of the house were a 46-year-old man, a doctor called Victor Ohta, and he was well known and well liked in his community. And his wife, 43-year-old Virginia, she was also one of the victims. They lived at home with their 2 sons and their 2 daughters. Now, it was soon confirmed that the 2 daughters, there was an 18-year-old called Tora, and she actually had left on Monday to go to school in New York, so they knew that she wasn't one of the victims. The other daughter was 15-year-old called Lark, and she'd been away at boarding school, so they knew that, again, she couldn't be one of the victims. But the 2 sons, Derek and Taggart, were found deceased. The final victim was 38-year-old Dorothy Cadwallader. She was the secretary for Victor. Now, as they were searching around the house, around the scene, one curious thing was that they couldn't actually find any shell casings, despite knowing that these people had been shot. It was abundantly clear that whoever had done this had shot these people, execution style mostly, before dumping their bodies in or nearby the pool. Then they had set fire to the house and then they'd fled. The house was then cordoned off and it was searched for any kind of evidence. Now, outside of the property, the vehicles were also taken in. They were part of the crime scene. But what they noticed was that the vehicles there were only the ones belonging to Mr. and Mrs. Ohta. There was no vehicle there for the secretary, Dorothy, and they would have expected to see this. They made a note of that, but meanwhile, all of the autopsies were being performed for the 5 bodies, and it was determined that Victor had been shot twice in the back and once under the arm with a .38 caliber pistol. Each of the other victims had suffered a single gunshot wound to the back of the neck, and that was from a .22 caliber. It was, however, clear that some of the victims had water in their lungs, and so it was likely that they were thrown into the pool after they'd been shot, but whilst they were still alive. They had suffered gunshot wounds, but that wasn't what they died from. They died from drowning. The sheriff decided to conduct a news conference to inform the public of what had happened. And as they were speaking, they said that they were still searching for the perpetrator in this case. But it was in this press conference that he also outlined that they were most likely looking for more than one person as the perpetrator. He also confirmed that the fire had been set intentionally, and at this point they believed that the reason the perpetrator or perpetrators had done this was not actually to cover up the scene, but it was to draw attention to the murders. This was some kind of statement, and people were worried. There was a real belief that this incident had been inspired by the Manson family murders. It had happened just a year earlier, and this area itself wasn't too far from High Ashbury, where those Manson killings had taken place. And rumours began circling about how Victor had previously been harassed by what was described as hippies. They'd come to his door unannounced, and he had ended up chasing them off of his property. Now, when the investigation team was searching the area, the crime scene, they found a note. It was a typewritten note, and it had been placed on the windshield wiper of Victor's Rolls Royce. Now it said, quote, "Halloween 1970. Today World War III will begin, as brought to you by the people of the free universe. From this day forward, anyone and or company of persons who misuses the natural environment or destroys it will suffer the penalty of death by the people of the free universe. I and my comrades from this day forth will fight until death or freedom against anything or anyone who does not support natural life on this planet. Materialism must die, or mankind will." Knight of Wands, Knight of Cups, Knight of Pentacles, Knight of Swords. This had a distinct link to tarot, specifically the Knight part. It symbolised power. Whilst tips began to come in about that note, the investigation continued progressing forward. Victor's secretary, Dorothy, who had also been killed in this attack, her husband, Jack, spoke to the press, and he said that he believed the murders were the work of another Manson-like cult, and he didn't want any, quote, crazies coming around here. Jack added that he wasn't even sure why his wife had been at Victor and Virginia's house. There was speculation that she'd been babysitting the younger children, but Jack said that wasn't true. She didn't even work from the house, so even he didn't know why she'd been there. Alongside this, police were still looking for 1968 green Oldsmobile station wagon. This was missing. It had been missing since the day of the murders, and it was likely their escape vehicle. A Be on the Lookout was sent out to officers in the area, but time had passed. There was no telling where they would be. There was no telling if they would even still be driving this car. But they got a really, really useful tip. It was around 4:45 p.m. that next Tuesday, so not long after the murders at all, that Virginia's car was found completely abandoned and set on fire in a tunnel near Henry Cowell State Park.
The car, which the killers had used to get away from the murder scene, was found late yesterday. They had driven it to a railroad tunnel and set it afire, and a train hit it. Police lashed out around the tunnel area. They found footprints, and they found an eyewitness who had seen, he said, 3 woods near the car. If those were the killers, they apparently camped out there after the crime.
There was no sign of the perpetrators, but the car had been found in the middle of the afternoon, and when it was found, it was still ablaze, so whoever had been driving it could not be far away. This was the strongest lead they had, and so they went all out in exhausting all possibilities. In fact, over 200 firefighters were dispatched to the scene where the car had been found. Some of them were sent to the nearby lake, and others were sent to Redwood Forest to try and find these people or these perpetrators or perpetrator. Presumably, at this point, they would be travelling by foot. They'd obviously lost the getaway vehicle. And alongside this, the car itself was brought in for forensic testing. They hoped that they'd be able to find some kind of fingerprints or any kind of evidence that might lead them to the perpetrator or perpetrators. And with this, a tip line was set up and reports came flooding in about the car. One woman said that she'd seen 3 people near to where the car was eventually found. And on a search, forensics managed to isolate 3 separate footprints, and 2 of these were footprints with shoes, but one of them was from bare feet. Another report came in from a woman who called in on Tuesday afternoon saying that she'd seen 3 people by the car, and she described them as all in their early 20s with long hair, and one of them had an orange backpack. It's quite clear from the reporting from around this time that people were very much fearful. There was a peak of gun purchases in the local area, and one of the books that I used to source for this case, Kill a Prophet by Catherine Ramsland, reported that one gun store said they had a 500% increase in gun sales at this particular time. Meanwhile, tips have been coming in thick and fast once the information in that note that was found on Victor's Rolls-Royce windshield were released to the public. 3 men came in to talk about someone they knew who had spoken about certain specific things, and these things fully aligned with the contents of the note. They told officers about how this man had spoken about, quote, ripping off materialists, and that although they believed that they might be in danger if they said his name, they also knew that they were pretty sure he had something to do with these murders. The man they were talking about was 24-year-old John Linley Frasier. He lived with his mother, Patricia, in a shack not too far from the murder house. His parents had separated when he was just 2 years old, and he'd been put into foster care when he was 5. John dropped out of high school in 1961, and by the age of 15, he was taken into police custody for criminal activities. Now, beyond this, John did seem to lead a pretty normal life in terms of settling down, getting married. He even had a child, a baby girl, with his wife, and he worked as a mechanic. However, it was sometime in the late 1960s, some reports say that it was 1970, that he was involved in a motorcycle accident, and this was a real turning point in his life. He actually ended up leaving his family. He became extremely religious. He would often study the Bible for hours and hours on end, and he spoke about believing that he could actually hear the voice of God. This voice told him that he had been reincarnated with a mission to save the world from materialism. He also owned a large selection of guns, and he did a lot of LSD. More recently, he'd started going on environmentalist rants that were violent in nature, especially with a focus on aggression and violence towards the establishment. These 3 men gave a solid description of John. They said he was a man with a full beard, he had long, blonde, dirty hair, and he was short in stature. Interestingly, there had been a sighting of John just days before the murders, walking close to but away from Victor and Virginia's house. The person who gave this sighting spoke specifically about how they'd seen this man a number of times before this date. Obviously, this is a potential link for those bare footprints that were found nearby to where the car was abandoned. Officers were dispatched to John's shack, but when they arrived there, they looked ahead and they could see that the only way to get over to the shack itself was by this kind of drawbridge that was operated by a cable. It was almost impossible, or at the very least, it would make it very hard for anyone to gain access. Eventually, they did manage to get across the bridge and to the shack, but unfortunately, when they got there, they realised that no one was inside. John was nowhere to be seen. Whilst they were inside, however, they did find that there was a viewpoint through one of the windows that looked directly up into the mountains through the trees, and you could see Victor's house there. From that very spot, John would have been able to see the family. He would have been able to look at them and watch what they were doing every single day. By the end of the next day, the police, who had stationed themselves outside of the shack and waited for John's return, they had actually managed to arrest him and bring him back to the station for questioning. John was positively identified in a lineup as the person who witnesses had seen either driving or near to the car that had eventually been abandoned. John's fingerprints were taken, and it wasn't too long before they were matched to a beer can that was found at the murder scene. They were also matched to fingerprints found on Victor's Rolls Royce. And on top of this, they confiscated a number of guns from his house, from his shack, and they were tested for ballistics, and there was found to be one that was a match to the .38 caliber that had killed Victor. It turned out that when John had started exhibiting more and more extreme views, mainly to do with environmentalism and his anger towards those who he saw as destroying it, he'd also honed a specific type of anger towards his neighbour, Victor. He did not like his life of luxury, and witness reports came in about how John had spoken about, quote, big things, and that they were going to happen on October the 19th, which was the day of the murders. Once he was in custody, John gave details about what had actually happened that night. He'd broken into the family home that afternoon with the initial goal being to, quote, exact revenge on those for raping the environment. But once he actually got inside, he discovered that there was only one family member at home, Virginia. He used the gun to force her to comply with him, and then he used one of Victor's scarves to bound her hands and her feet together. And then he went off searching the house. Now eventually he found another gun, and that would be the gun, or one of the guns, that he would use later that night. And finally, as he was making his way back through the house, he found animal skins on the floor used as decoration, and he said that this absolutely infuriated him. And so then he just sat and waited, his anger kind of bubbling every minute that passed by. The next thing to happen was that Victor's secretary, Dorothy, arrived at the house with the youngest son, Taggart. She'd picked him up from school, and she was simply coming to drop him off before leaving again. But as she entered the house, that is when John held the gun up to her and forced her to comply. He managed to then get both Dorothy and Taggart tied up, so he's now got 3 people in the house all tied up. It was a little while later that Victor and Derek, the other son, arrived back home. And of course, they were also threatened and they were also tied up. John's version of what happened next was that he spoke for a while. He was being passionate and talking about materialism. And then he specifically honed in on Victor and told him about how he was ruining the Santa Cruz landscape. He was the reason for all of this. Now, Victor responded to this by apologising to him. He begged him to just let his family go, that he would do anything, he would give him anything he wanted, pay him any amount of money. But of course, that's not what John wanted. The pair then got into an argument, and this caused John to push Victor into the pool outside. He then raised his gun, aimed it at Victor, and shot 3 times. After that, John turned to the other 4 people, all of them still tied up, and he asked each of them if they believed in God. One by one, they replied that yes, they did. And John simply turned to them and said good, and that they had nothing to worry about. He then shot each of them in the back of the neck before he threw them into the pool and then left to go back to the house to set it alight. After he started the fire, he then stole the car and made his getaway. Now, the reason the police were so convinced that there was more than one perpetrator at the beginning was because they just weren't sure how one person could have tied up these 5 individual people. Of course, now that they had all the timings and now that they knew that each person had been tied up individually, they knew this was possible, and John had in fact committed the murders alone. John's defence that he should be found not guilty by reason of insanity, and they said that this had happened because he'd been in a car accident around 6 months before the murders, and this had completely altered his brain, and essentially that meant that he was not sane. Anyway, the trial went ahead in October of the following year, and the prosecution presented evidence that, in fact, this was thought out. John had actually been in the house way before the murders had happened, and that when he was there, he stole a pair of binoculars. They even had one of the daughters testify that a pair of binoculars had been taken from the house. And forensics also showed that there was a kind of metallic substance on one of John's knife, and this was the knife that he used to cut the wire cords inside of the murder house. John was found guilty on all 5 counts of murder, but the question of his sanity had still not been determined, and so John decided to exact And so John decided to admit exactly what had happened on that fateful day. After that, his sanity would be determined. So at one point during this, John introduced the idea that there were 3 other people with him, which actually would tally with what some of the witnesses said. But he would later retract this and said that actually he was completely alone. Another time he spoke about how voices from God had instructed him to carry out this murderous rampage, and that he had visual and auditory hallucinations. Later he said that he was John from the Bible, and that he had developed this kind of system of beliefs that were based in astrology, they were based in reincarnation, and they were based in immorality. The prosecution's expert stated that John was a sociopath, not schizophrenic as had been suggested by the defence. Ultimately, John was found guilty and he was sentenced to death. This, however, was only upheld until 1976 when the Supreme Court decided that capital punishment was unconstitutional, and so his sentence was commuted to life in prison. In August 2009, John was found hanged in his cell from an apparent suicide. Now, there really wasn't much information about his time in prison up to this point, but of course, there were 2 teenage girls left behind after he killed an entire family. Lark and Tora continued on with their lives, with Tora getting married twice and then going on to have a baby daughter. However, she was so overcome with grief and eventual depression that she actually ended up taking her own life, aged just 25. The youngest daughter, Lark, and the final surviving member of the family, graduated from Stanford University shortly after her older sister's suicide. She's now married with 2 daughters, and she lives in Seattle, Washington. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of REDRUM. As always, I have a recommendation for you. This is Heretic. It is a film that it's absolutely, it's interesting. It's out in the UK at the minute. I think it comes out in the US maybe next week. It's got Hugh Grant in it. I just think he's brilliant. He's so blunt. He's so clearly just done with the media, just absolutely sensationalising everything. It's so refreshing. I just want to watch absolutely anything he's in. And I really, really recommend going and watching some of his interviews because he's just really funny. The film itself, especially the first half, was really brilliant. It's a really good portrayal of, it just sort of builds up tension really well. I would say that the second half lost me a little bit. It just went in a bit of a direction that I wasn't really too bothered about, but I loved the first half. It felt so real and creepy, and it's just such a well-made film, I think. The other 2 main actors, Sophie Thatcher and Chloe East, are phenomenal too. It's a really, really brilliant watch. If you do have a watch, obviously let me know what you think. And other than that, I will see you next week for another episode of REDRUM. Oh, also, I am doing a kind of REDRUM newsletter. It's just going to be once a month, and it will add on any bits of information that might be missed from cases, any updates, any kind of opinion based sort of articles that I think are interesting. If you want to be involved in that, if you want to receive those newsletters, I'll leave a link in the description box down below. I think the first one will be at the end of November, so you've got a little while to sign up for it. And other than that, I'll see you next week. Bye.